Good afternoon, church. Refuge Church. Here we are again. We're in the Torah Series. We're back in the book of Exodus. Today, we are in Exodus chapter 3. We've been following the people of Israel growing up in Egypt, and they have been so blessed by God that they've just flourished and grown, and they are now a multitude within Egypt. And the new Pharaoh of Egypt says, whoa, we got to slow these guys down. Let's enslave them because he was afraid that they would just take over or something. And so they are now slaves in Egypt and they're crying out to God. And last week, we saw that God heard their groaning, he heard their cries, and he's going to send somebody to be a leader to rescue the Israelites from Exodus. And so God raises up Moses. Now, Moses, remember from last week, wasn't a Levite. He was a Levite, so he's from the tribe of Levi, and he's going to be raised up by God to get Israel through this tumultuous time and rescue them from Egypt. But today, before he becomes the leader, he is going to meet God face to face, and he's going to learn his name. And we already have it written here on the paper, I am. And we're going to learn what that means straight from the text. So we're in Exodus chapter 3. I'm just going to read, instead of bouncing around from verse to verse or chapter to chapter, we're just going to be here. So I'm going to read chapter 3, verses 1 through 17. And so bear with me while I read through this. Here we go. Now, Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. And he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why this bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I've heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hands of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression of which the Egyptians oppressed them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel to Egypt, out of Egypt? He said, But I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Then Moses said to God, If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? Here it is, folks. God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, he has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I shall be remembered throughout all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have observed you and what has been done to you in Egypt, and I promise that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. Wow, there's a lot going on there. But let's see what this passage has to say about God. Once again, what is it that Moses finds out about God? Well, first of all, when he sees the burning bush and he goes over to it, God calls to him out of the bush and he says, Moses, do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. Guys, this is so important. God's defining characteristic. God's defining characteristic. The thing that makes God God is his holiness. God is holy. And in this passage, even his presence makes the ground itself holy. His presence makes the things that are around him holy. The ground's holy because God is. To think of God is to think of the most holy being in all of existence. And he is eternal. He's never had a beginning, right? He'll never have an end. He's always holy. He's always been holy. So what does it mean that he's holy? Well, to be holy is this, to be separated. It's a simple word, to be separate or separated or distinct. Distinct, let's write that down. God is distinct from his creation. He's not like his creation. Even like us, we're made to be like him in a way. But even with that being said, God is not like us. He is distinct from us in very particular ways. And he's certainly distinct from his creation. He's not created while we are. He's not dependent while we are dependent. He is life-giving. We rely on his life-giving, right? And so he is completely separate, completely distinct, and far beyond anything we can imagine. Far beyond anything we can imagine. He's separate, but he's also so far beyond our wildest thoughts, our wildest dreams. We think we can understand God, and at that very point that we think we do, we actually don't, okay? God has specifically given us the Word so that we can know him better, but even with the Word, he's so far beyond what we as humans can understand with our finite minds that we only get a glimpse or the tip of the iceberg, if you will. There's so much to God that we don't know, we don't understand, and we have to learn. And we will be learning for all of eternity. But also there's a third part of what holiness means, and it just means purity. Holiness is a purity. I don't know why it did it like that. Holiness is a separation, a distinctness, but it's also a purity. So to say that God is holy means he is more pure than anything else in all creation in every way. And so God's presence, God is holy. God's presence makes the ground itself holy and makes the things in his presence holy. Those who are in God's presence are holy. But what is man's response? Well, let's see what Moses does. Verse 6, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. We recognize that very well, don't we? And Moses, what does Moses do? And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. The proper response of man to God's holiness is fear, is the fear of God. We see this right here with Moses hiding his face because he was afraid to look at God. He's so pure. He's so beyond anything I can imagine. I'm afraid to even look in that direction. We see this in Isaiah 6, where God saw the Lord seated on the throne, and Isaiah was saying, oh, I'm coming undone. Woe is me, for I am a man of unclean lips. In other words, every part of me is unclean, and I see that now because I see the holiness of God. We see this in Job whenever we go for 36, 37 chapters where Job and his friends are talking, and then all of a sudden God himself comes on the scene and he speaks to Job and his friends, and Job just sits back and says, whoa, I guess I didn't know what I was talking about. And the text says that Job says, I despise myself and I repent in dust and ashes. Job's response was a humility. It was a lowering of himself. Like, I don't deserve to even say the things that I just said. So fear is this trembling, this humbling, a trembling and a humbling, a lowering of the self. When you lower yourself before God, when you humble yourself and you are reverent towards God, but it's more than reverence. See, people talk about, I hear a lot of even pastors talk about it's just reverence. Well, it's not just reverence. It's a trembling reverence. We are to tremble before God. It's not so far as being in terror before God. You're not just like, it's hard to explain because Isaiah was really freaking out. You know, he was saying, well, it feels like I'm literally coming undone here. But there's this trembling before God, and it's not a fear like I'm going to run away towards God. It's I'm trembling in his presence. And so that's the best word that I can think of how to use is tremble. And we've talked about that before. I remember in Philippians, back in the day when we were in Philippians. So if we were to understand God, if we're to correctly obey him and correctly follow him well, in other words, if we're to correctly live out the Christian life, we must have a healthy fear of God. Not a terror of God, but a trembling, reverent, humble, lowly fear of God, lowering ourselves in his presence. And this is in direct response to God's holiness. So I would just challenge you right now to study God's holiness, to look through the Bible to see what the scripture says about his holiness, not just this, even though we get a big glimpse of it in this chapter. Next, God's name. God's name. What's in a name? What's in God's name? What does he call himself? For the very first time, he says, Moses, I'm going to tell you my name. This is the name that you're going to call me by. And first of all, verse 12 says this. Moses said, who am I? In verse 11, he says, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? And that you may bring my people, and bring my people, the people of Israel, out of Egypt. Who am I that I'm going to be the one? I'm going to be the man who goes to Pharaoh. But what does God respond by saying? He says, I will be with you. That's my promise, Moses. I will be with you. And then Moses says, okay, if I go to your people, Israel, and I say, okay, God, the God of your fathers, the God of our fathers has sent me, and what if they say, okay, what is his name? What am I going to tell them? And he says, Moses, my name is I will be who I will be. There's a word in here, or a couple of words. In verse 14, he says, Moses, I am who I am. I am who I am. I am who I am. This can also be translated, I will be who I will be. There's a continuing aspect, like whoever I am, that's who I'm going to be. There's a consistency. This is what this means. There's a consistency in God's character. You can always expect God to be God. If God says that he's something, like in this passage, he says, I will be with you. If God says, okay, I will be with you, then you can always expect God to be with you. There's a consistency in his character and a consistency in his promises. And so when Moses says, what do I say? What's your name? What do I tell them? What do I tell these people? He gives them this name. Now he's never given his people, even Abraham himself, never given them this name before. This name, what we call the Lord in capital letters. If you might have in your scriptures, it might have Lord, Lord in all capital letters. This is Yahweh. This is God's covenant name. So those who are closest to God, those are called by his name, those who are called God's people, God's family, God's children, they know him by the name Yahweh or Jehovah. And we translate it a lot of times as just Lord with all capital letters. But this is what it's hearkening back to, this moment in time where God says, I am who I am. So what exactly does this mean? What does it mean that God is the I am, or the I am who I am, or even I will be who I will be? Well, we've already said that this is consistency in God's character, but it's also the measurement of goodness. The measurement of goodness. How do we know what goodness is? We measure it by God's character. Let me move myself out of the way a little bit so you can see. Okay. How do we measure goodness? How do we know what things are good and what things are not good? We measure it by God's character. How do we know what things are lovely? How do we know what love is? By God's character. How do we know what holiness is? We measure it by God's character. Faithfulness, fatherhood, righteousness, peace and patience. How do we know what any of those things are? By looking at God's character, and the measure of what righteousness is God's character. I am. This is a fullness of existence. Everything is measured by what I am, right? How do we know what sin is? Well, by looking at whatever the opposite of what God's character is. God cannot sin. The scripture says God is unable to sin. This is very important because to be able to sin means that you're not God, because sin is literally the opposite of God's character. So for God to sin means that he acts against his character. It means God becomes not God, and that doesn't make any sense at all, right? So God is unable to sin, and we know what sin is by measuring it against God's character. If it's not God's character, it's sin. It's sinful, right? So, God is, his name is the I am. And this harkens back to I am who I am is who he tells Moses who he is. Or this also means I will be who I will be. So we've seen two things in this name, this I am name. We've seen consistency in character. We've seen the measurement of all character, of all goodness, of all things are measured against God. And then thirdly, let's see if I can get it up here. Thirdly, he's the sustainer of created existence. We've already said that God is eternal. He never had a beginning. He'll never have an end. And he created and sustains all existence. Notice the word I in I am means that no one else holds this name. There's no other person who can say, I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. There's no other person who can call themselves the great I am. Only the God of the Bible. In fact, not just any God, but God specifically says something about his story, doesn't he? And we saw this in verse 15. God says to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. Notice what he did there. He calls himself the Lord, which actually, if you look at it, it says Yahweh. I just popped up the little note right there. This is the ESV note. It says this, the Lord, in all caps, means Yahweh, YHWH, which is to be, or I am, right? And so this name, Yahweh, is his name that he's calling himself by, but he's attaching it to his story. What is his story? Well, we've already learned he is the God of the Israelites, the fathers of Israel, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So God connects these two things: his story, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the God and Yahweh, his name, his story and his name. These two are inseparable. To know the true God is to know the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's his story. And to know God by his name, Yahweh. So, do you know Yahweh? Do you know the great I am? Do you understand his holiness? Do you respond in fear to his holiness? Do you measure all things in life up against his character? Do you trust God that he is and will be faithful and will not change in character? Is God faithful? Yes. Will he ever change in his faithfulness? No. Is God the perfect Father? Yes. Will he ever change in his fatherhood? No. Is God perfectly righteous? Yes. Will he ever change in his righteousness? No. God will be who he will be. And so our response then is reverent fear. It's a lowering of the self, a trembling and a humbling before God's holiness. This is where we live daily. This is where we make our home. This is where every Christian stays. And we recognize that the God of the Bible, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is himself. He has revealed himself as the great I am who I am. And not only that, but let's end with this note. Let's see if I can find the verse right here, verse 15. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. God is the I am, and that's his name forever. Remember it. Tell it to your kids. Tell it to everyone. Tell others about the God who is the great I am. See you guys next week.